My name's Alice Tipping, and I'm the Director of Trade and Sustainability Work at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We will be running this webinar in English, but pour nos collègues francophones, il y a de l'interprétation simultanée de l'anglais au français disponible juste en bas de cette fenêtre. So to make sure that we're as inclusive of LDCs and NFIDCs as possible. So this webinar is being run by the IISD, my organization, and by the International Food Policy Research Institutes. I'll be delighted to be moderating this, but I have to say all credit for its organization goes to my colleague Facundo Calvo, who has put it all together. And I can see in our participants list WTO delegates and officials from a huge range of time zones, from Guyana to Timor-Leste. This is wonderful. We're really keen to make sure that even smaller economies are well versed in the WTO's agriculture negotiations, which are so important for all of us. Coming back to the negotiations, where are we? Well, we're in sort of 2 and a bit months out from MC13, the WTO's last big ministerial conference. And the outcomes on agriculture, or lack of outcomes, were frankly a big disappointment to our institute as much as anyone else. So in an effort to come back again to these issues, because they are crucially important for many of the smallest WTO members, we thought we'd put together this webinar to assist you in looking back at what's on the table, at the potential value on the table, and at hearing from both your fellow delegates and from agricultural experts about ways forward. Right? What do we see if we look at what's on the table, specifically from the perspective of LDCs, NFIDCs, and SIDS? We're focusing on domestic support, essentially because, as many previous chairs of the negotiations have said, domestic support is one of the negotiating areas of most interest to the widest number of members. It's also a negotiating area that enjoyed a significant amount of momentum, particularly in the lead up to MC13. We had new proposals and submissions on domestic support. We're going to focus in this discussion on 3 of the most recent ones, tabled by the African Group in Pakistan, by the Cairns Group in Ukraine, and by India, to identify possible areas of convergence and to look at what's on the table again from the perspective of those who are most vulnerable. It won't be easy, but we will do our best, and we have some fantastic academic minds to help us through. Having said that, we are focusing specifically on these rules from a development perspective. It's one that is often talked about in passing, but doesn't often receive a real focus. So this is what we thought we'd do today. We're looking both at what rules would be of most benefit to LDCs and NFIDCs and SIDS, and also what flexibilities would be of benefit to them both. We've been thinking about these problems, as have these governments, for a number of years. And we thought that it would be useful to have, as part of our discussion, part of our analysis, perspectives from representatives of these groups, as well as from experts. So we're absolutely delighted to have Omar Cissé from the Permanent Mission of Senegal, who is the LDC coordinator on agriculture. Many of you know him already, but Omar, thank you very much for giving us your time. We're also really grateful to have Taisha Turner from the Permanent Mission of Jamaica, who's the CARICOM focal point on agriculture. And we'll be very grateful. In fact, we're going to start this webinar in recognition of how busy they are, with their perspectives on the domestic support question in particular, and what they believe would be of most benefit to the members that they represent and who they coordinate. We're then going to hear from 3 experts on agricultural trade about what they see as the potentially most useful rules or flexibilities, those that would serve the most to advance the interests of LDCs and other vulnerable members. So David Laborde from the FAO will speak to the specific interests of LDCs, and Joe Glauber from IFPRI, our co-organizers, will add some thoughts with a specific focus on public stockholding. Lars Brink, who is one of the sharpest minds on trade policy, is going to help us to pull it all together, I think, at the end, to look across the proposals, to consider the extent to which there are convergences on some domestic support issues, and there are, in fact, more than you might think, but also to consider the extent to which what's on the table speaks to the priorities that some of the previous speakers have identified. Now, you'll have noticed that we've set this up as a webinar rather than as a meeting. That means that if you have questions as the discussion progresses, please do put them in the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom window. And I hereby encourage the speakers to respond to the questions as they see them come up in writing, or perhaps through their presentations as we go along. A word perhaps to manage expectations about timing. We may or may not get to the point where we have time for an open discussion at the end. If we do, I will be pulling up some of the questions in the chat. So please make sure that you have them in the chat so they can be addressed as we go along. And also in case we run out of time. We have prioritized in this webinar hearing from delegations and hearing from experts who know these topics extremely well, and also so that we have in the recording of this video, of this webinar, a good summary for people who aren't able to join us right now. So with all of that in mind, with no further ado, I'm pleased to give the floor first, perhaps to you, Omar. It would be really interesting to hear your perspective on what matters most in domestic support from the LDC perspective. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to thank very much indeed IISD and its partner institution, IFPRI, for organizing this important webinar on the subject of domestic support at WTO. My name is Omar Cissé. I work at I'm the first advisor at the Permanent Mission of Senegal and the focal point on agriculture. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. First of all, I would like to set out the context. As you will know, at the moment we are noting disruptions to global food supply and a risk of food insecurity, which derives from climate change and also from the persistent impacts of COVID-19 and also from conflicts, particularly the conflict in Ukraine. Next slide, please. As regards the specific case of the LDCs, we have to note that if we had to do a diagnosis of the agricultural sector, on the strengths side, on the left, we have to note that agriculture really is the main source of subsistence and food security for LDCs. That's the first main point. It's also the main economic sector that contributes significantly to these countries' GDPs, and it's the main provider of jobs in our countries. But another important point is that 65% of non-cultivated arable land remaining in the world are located in Africa. And as you will know, most of the LDCs are African countries. We have 25 members, the LDC group, that are African countries. So Africa should be able to feed a large part, quite a considerable part of the world and itself. However, our members are faced with production problems and also problems on the markets due to export restrictions. Our countries also depend too much on imports. We're too dependent on imports. And with exchange rate volatility and climate change, we face a considerable risk of food insecurity. And that's why measures have to be taken in order to counter these risks of food insecurity. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, as regards domestic support, what we as LDCs propose is that as regards Article 6.2, which concerns the development programs, we believe there's a great need for investment in inputs among the LDCs. And there is also a need to preserve the existing flexibilities in favor of low-income farmers. That's why we recommend that domestic support be granted to low-income producers or producers with low resources, few resources. They should not be subject to limitations. And under Article 6.2, there should be no subjection to limitations, and these amounts should not be included in the calculation of domestic support, which has an exchange trade distorting impact. Next slide, please. Also, as regards the aggregate measure of support, only 33 members have an AMS at the expense of others. And the concentration of the AMSs in a single product can give rise to trade distortion. That's why we are recommending that the support, the domestic support, which is granted to producers, well, in fact, there's a slight mistake here, but what we propose in this respect is to limit, not only to get rid of this asymmetry, but to limit the AMS to the level of de minimis. We should be at the same level of limitations as de minimis. Next slide, please. As regards the production limitation program for the blue box, production limitation program for the blue box, there is an excessive limitation of production, or rather an excessive limitation of production can give rise to an increase in prices or other trade distortions. So one negative effect is this increase in prices. And our recommendation concerns the need to integrate support under the blue box in the calculation of the FBT AMS, and to subject it to the same limitations, the level of de minimis. So I believe we have to head in the direction of reducing this type of support. Next slide, please. Next. We also have the case of cotton. As you will know, the members of the Cotton 4 are all LDCs. We have made the following observations. There is a failure to respect the ministerial decisions in favor of cotton-producing countries, and there is also unfair competition from the large cotton-producing countries. That's why we recommend that the commitments contained in the Nairobi ministerial decision on cotton be fully implemented in the 3 pillars of market access, domestic support, and export competition. And we recommend that the negotiations be continued on domestic support on cotton in accordance with the mandates agreed by ministers in Hong Kong, Bali, and Nairobi, in order to address the question of cotton ambitiously, quickly, and specifically, in order to give rise to substantial reductions. Next slide, please. Another problem concerns Annex 2. As you will know, as regards public stock holding for food security purposes, what we recommend is that we recommend that the Bali clause dates from 2013, and it is limited to the programs that existed at that time. We would also like to note that the reference price, which is utilized to calculate domestic support for public stock holding, poses a problem because it's a reference price that dates from 1986 to 1988. And it's therefore necessary, the group is in favor of a permanent solution. The LDC group is in favor of a permanent solution, which would cover all the programs, present and future, of the LDCs. They should be taken into account in this Bali clause. But it's also necessary to update this benchmark price, external benchmark price, which is out of date. And if you calculate domestic support based on this 1986 price, you will find yourself with exorbitant amounts. And this makes little sense economically. The public stock holding that we want is that it should, this should not take into account in the overall calculation of the support provided to our products. As regards clarification of the criteria of the green box, we believe that these criteria are not clear enough. And that's why we propose more clarity, because this lack of clarity favors certain types of subsidies. If you look at Annex 2, paragraphs 5 and following, you will find yourself with types of subsidies which can give rise to distortions. These are defects which we believe should be corrected by further clarifying the category, the criteria of these criteria. So we should guarantee these measures don't have a trade distorting effect, or at least a minimal effect. Next slide, please. Next. Moving on now to the special safeguard clause. As you will know, we are faced with massive imports of subsidized products into our countries, and at the same time, we don't have the possibility to use the safeguard clause, which is reserved for certain members. And then the conditions for using the safeguard mechanism, which are provided for by the Agreement on Agriculture, are too complex for LDCs. That's why today it is rather difficult to combat these subsidies of imports to our countries. That's why we are recommending that a simplified mechanism be put in place compared with the existing compensatory measures that would enable the developing countries, including the LDCs, to increase their tariff protection on imports of food products which have benefited from subsidies. Next slide, please. What we would like to share with you on this subject is on the screen. We would like to thank you very much indeed for your attention, and I remain at your disposal for any questions. Thank you very much. We would like to thank you, Mr. Cissé, for your very clear presentation, which was very easy to follow.
So thank you very much indeed. It was extremely useful. And I took away a number of in fact, quite a long list of very concrete points, right? The need for space for LDC zone subsidies, the problem of AMS concentration and the question of limits there, the urgent need for a final agreement on cotton, the idea of public stock holding for LDCs, which I think we'll come back to, the idea of clarifying the measures of the green box, and the need for a special safeguard mechanism. All a very clear and very useful list. And thank you very much for spelling it out so well in the presentation. I think this will be a reference for all of us going forward. So thank you for the time it took to put that together. Very helpful indeed from the LDC perspective. Paisha, as the coordinator of the CARICOM group, I'd be really interested in your perspective on the domestic support issue. Go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Alice, and good afternoon, good morning. to colleagues, depending on where we are. And I want to thank you as well, Alice, for really setting the scene with that overview as to the WTO negotiations. And I think Omar has laid excellent groundwork as it relates to the perspective from the LDCs. And of course, it's my great pleasure to share the perspectives and priorities from some of the other vulnerable economies within the WTO membership, namely small island developing states, SIDS, and net food importing developing countries, NFIDCs, notwithstanding that the former has not been recognized as a formal category or group within the context of the WTO agriculture negotiations. I think the wider consideration of small vulnerable economies beyond LDCs is always welcomed, as we have seen the pushback, at least in recent discussions, against inclusion of NFIDCs or attempts to curtail the flexibilities of same on the road to Abu Dhabi during the discussions on the chair's text. Now, I think to truly appreciate the priorities of SIDS and NFIDCs, we have to appreciate the characteristics, challenges, and criteria as it relates to these groups in a kernel, particularly as it relates to SIDS, the small size, insularity, remoteness, which we well know. Because of this, these countries face structural impediments, acute limitations as it relates to their resource base and domestic market opportunities, low productivity, and lack of economies of scale that then lead to limited integration and low trade competitiveness in international markets. It's for these reasons the WTO itself in the Marrakesh Agreement and in the Agreement on Agriculture did recognize that there's a need for the positive efforts to be designed to ensure that developing countries, especially the least developed among them, secure a share in the growth in international trade commensurate with the needs of their development, their economic development, as well as having regard to the special and differential treatment as an integral element of the negotiations, taking into account the possible negative effects of the reform program on least developed and NFIDCs. Now, from this perspective, I'd like to raise 3 priorities for us. And as indicated, Omar and his excellent groundwork, some of that has already been touched on. The 3: 1, food security; 2, preservation of the existing flexibilities contained in the Agreement on Agriculture; and 3, leveling the playing field as it stands. Now, bearing in mind that only 33 WTO members are entitled to this final bound total aggregate measurement of support, FBTAMS for short. However, these 33 members include developed countries, and within that 33, the level of support is further concentrated in a literal handful of the members. I think 7 members have more than 96% of the FBTMS global entitlement. So with that said, one may reason that the starting point for any discussion should be to level the playing field and eliminate the FBTAMS, which essentially, to our minds, provides sort of a skewed, backwards, special and differential treatment provision for developed countries beyond what many developing countries, SIDS and NFIDCs, who are in need of this expanded policy space and resources are able to provide. I know there are some experts who say that over time, the FBTMS will diminish in importance. And if that is the case, then perhaps it is a good argument for its elimination. So the SIDS and NFIDCs are already struggling to compete, and they will then further be sidelined in the market, particularly where this protection is directed to specific or focused on specific products. Now, for the next priority, even as SIDS and NFIDCs advocate for the level playing field, there is a need to secure and preserve the flexibilities within the Agreement on Agriculture, particularly in Article 6.2, Omar touched on that, for the investment subsidies to developing countries, import subsidies to low-income or resource-poor farmers, and for diversification from illicit and aquatic crops. To turn to one of the proposals that we do have on the table, Proposal 243, there is a restriction proposed in that document. I think it's paragraph 16 of Rev 2, which speaks to putting a possible cap, not on all 3 sub-elements, but a possible cap of $5 million USD on the investment and agricultural input subsidies, which of course we could not support. And you would wonder, and I'm sure the proponents will have some explanation as to the reason for this figure. But I think sometimes there's a tendency within some of these discussions to assess policy space for members based on what they currently provide, without consideration for the fact that many developing countries remain constrained by budgetary and other factors. And so this should not in any way support an argument that we should lower the policy space for these countries. That certainly, to my mind, would be regressive, and we're focusing here on being progressive. I also want to stay on proposal 243, the proposal there to eliminate the boxes, as well as to a folding in of the permanent solution on PSH within this blanket approach. To our minds, there's some value that can be retained from this box categorization, because it does allow for members to be able to customize the support based on their unique national experiences. As it relates to a permanent solution a la carte, a la 243, it's quite interesting because how it is presented, it would appear to undermine the special PSH as a special and differential treatment provision to developing countries, particularly in emergency situations. So I think these two elements would at least require an assessment. And I say that because as we currently have it on the Annex 2, as you know, it's directed to developing countries. But if I understand the 243 proposal well, then that, and it is indicated by those proponents that 243 should be the basis. They see that as the basis for a permanent solution on PSH. If that is the case, then it would be a blanket application, thereby to the point I'm raising, that it would appear to undermine PSH as a special and differential treatment provision. So it would require an assessment. You look at the impact that it would have on food security. I know Omar spoke about production. You know, the African group has been big on that production potential and policy space requirements for developing countries. So my third and final priority focus really, we know NFIDCs, we face compounded challenges. You know, we are already developing countries. Many of us are confronted with low growth, high debt burden, high debt to GDP ratio, and then we're grappling with being dependent, highly dependent on imports. And most of us know the situation in CARICOM in terms of the high food import bill for that region. Majority of us are NFIDCs, to the point where our heads have decided that they needed to create this initiative 25 by 2025 to see how we could reduce the high food import bill by 25% by 2025. So it's really important to us, and this raises the matter of food security. So for this reason, we were very happy. We welcome the adoption of the working group, the report of the working group on food security that was pursuant to the decision from MC 12, which looks on, and it gives recommendations on access to international food markets, financing of food imports, and agricultural production resilience for LDCs and NFIDCs, which is really important. And I just want to touch here, there's a proposal in 242 from the African group as it relates to ensuring food security by allowing developing countries to support beyond their de minimis levels. This is within the de minimis proposal. And this would be during a severe food crisis. And I think it actually, for want of a better pun, provides good food for thought. There is a limit. When I look at the proposal, there's a limit on the additional percentage to the de minimis that would be permitted. There's also a limit to the time that you would be able to apply this measure. And it has clear criteria. I think it's also taken into account outliers as well by their indication there of using an Olympic average. To my mind, this is perhaps a more appropriate response than what I've perhaps heard in the negotiating room, on encouraging developing countries to simply lower their tariffs to ensure food security, being fully cognizant that a lot of our governments do depend on the income from this. This is a major source of government revenue. That proposal in 242 as well, looking that focus on production and domestic production, to some it might appear as a reactionary measure, but I do think over time, in the long term, it could go some way to boosting the sustainable productive capacity of these countries. And you touched on something in your introduction, Alice, as it relates to the development dimension, at least for the delegation of Jamaica. It's been rather concerning what we observe as a progressive diminution of the primacy and importance of the development dimension since MC10 in Nairobi. So we believe that the urgent reassertion of and refocusing on the development dimension of the work of the WTO is absolutely necessary. And the saying that, my final point would be how we would address the pushback against reference to NFIDCs in these negotiations. I appreciate that from those delegations who raised the point, there are systemic concerns with the list in terms of, and there's an indication of continued advocacy to call for review of this list. And an additional concern is, how do countries graduate from the list? To my mind, I think there is scope for it to operate and emanate from the mandated review, as we would have it on the document G/AG/3. To me, it seems clear on the surface. And of course, I'm engaged with those colleagues, excellent colleagues to work with. And I think this is one way to move forward in the negotiations, to really be open to listening to each other to see where we can actually build that convergence. So to my mind, G/AG/3 speaks to the review during the March meeting. So perhaps it is not so much a matter of whether there's a legal scope or provision, but maybe more on the matter of how we implement or apply this provision as members. I most certainly on this point would welcome the thoughts from our external experts on this. One of the questions I have is, if the list were reviewed based on criteria that you would have, would there be any changes in the actual list as we have it? So finally, processes are currently unfolding to once again see if we can examine 242 and 243 towards convergence building. And this is now my personal point that, it does appear that the WTO rules-making process is quite reactionary, very reactive. It's based on reacting to current market challenges and political realities, which is necessary, but sometimes without a full assessment of how these rules will then have implication in what we call a dynamic and rapidly evolving trade arena. We have seen it even with how we're trying to discipline some of the rules in terms of some of the emerging economies that members apparently, when negotiating the agreement, had not envisaged that this would be the contribution from some of those members, even under domestic support itself. So going forward, just a call that members, all of us, should ensure that this current phase of the global trade rules making process should focus not just on addressing the perceived challenges or closing these offensive gaps, but should also ensure that we're making trade work for the membership and delivering for the LDCs and developing countries, such as the SVEs, SIDs, and NFIDCs. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Super, Aisha, thank you very much indeed. And I think a really interesting sort of forward-looking point to end on. Climate change is already having a massive impact on how production works, on how food is traded, and that impact will only increase, right? So building a resilient, in every sense, a resilient global food system, I think is one of the ultimate goals we should be aiming for. But thank you. You talked about leveling the playing field and the idea of eliminating sort of bound total AMSs. Maintain flexibility, not only for current subsidies, but for future subsidies for smaller countries. An interesting idea. Interesting comments on public stock holding. And I think it's partly a technical and partly a political choice of weaving it into a broader domestic support discussion. And the specific food security perspective, which is in fact, as you were saying, different from the African group, right? Who have, as Monsieur Cisse was saying, huge production potential. Not the case for SIDS in most cases. So the food security discussion looks very different, right? And I can imagine that I'm originally from New Zealand. I know what natural disasters look like in the Pacific region, and the idea of a severe food crisis is a very real one and a very sudden one when it happens. So very interesting to hear all of that. I can see a couple of questions also coming in the Q&A box. Rest assured that the Q&A box stays within us. We are a large group, we're up to 106, but you can answer questions in the Q&A box without fear of anyone else outside this group seeing it. That has been extremely helpful, Omar, thank you, and Taisha. Maybe now we'll turn to the experts to see how this problem looks from the outside. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to give the floor next to an old friend, David Laborde from the FAO. David, you've been thinking about this for about as long as anyone else. What would you change in the WTO rules on domestic support from an LDC perspective? Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Alice. Thanks for organizing with Facundo this event and your friend also at IFPRI, and thanks everyone for attending. So clearly I have not thought for as long as Lars about this, so I'm speaking under the scrutiny of people wiser and smarter than me. But yes, I'm going to talk about some important elements, I think, about the LDCs. Some of my remarks will be relevant for seeds, for instance, and other vulnerable economies. But I think also we want to make sure we deal with them in a bit of separate way, because they can face similar problems. But even from a legal point of view and the type of instrument they have access overall, it's not the same case. And I will be happy to have a full discussion on seeds too, but not today. Next slide, please. Let me first say that I'm going to cover two main aspects. One is really the question about flexibilities versus discipline and this question of policy space, but actually also what it means to give policy space to a large number of countries that also can impact LDCs. I really think that, you know, and we are not 20 years ago or 30 years ago when developing countries were a much more homogeneous group. Now we are talking about very different economies in terms of size, in terms of market dynamics, in terms of access to finance and capacity for government to spend money in agriculture. And that's what we want to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So really, just I want to, when we talk about LDCs, I think we need to keep things in perspective. So unfortunately, they represent a growing share of the global population, not because we don't want this country to grow, but just because it means that globally, the size and the number of people in LDCs has increased. Even if we think about development, the people that we have kind of left behind us is an increasing share of the population. So when we are talking about this, we talk about more than 1 person over 10 on Earth is in LDCs. So it's 13% of the global population with a strong demographic growth. That's also why this share of population increased. And so their food needs increase. Now, they just represent 4% of agricultural production. So clearly, it also means that they are not producing as much as they would like to or as they can. But also anything they will do are not going to be a major shock for agricultural markets. So now, 1 person undernourished over 3 are in LDCs. You know, so 13% of the population, but 1/3 of the people in chronic hunger. So people that, I'm not talking about here about healthy diets or good nutrition. I'm talking about people that doesn't have enough calories to operate properly every day. And it has been already reminded by some of the previous speakers, the LDCs have been in front line of some major shocks, conflict, climate-related events, and basically the number of people in chronic hunger in this country have increased by 32% in 10 years. So basically, since we said in 2015, we are going to eradicate hunger in the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Agreement, for the LDCs, the number of hungry mouths has increased by 1/3. And at the same time, they also represent then like 1% of the money spent in agriculture, depending if we talk about support or overall spending. Here you will see also a question mark, because as I'm going to say, it's difficult to know how much LDCs are spending actually, but just, you know, this order of magnitude. So big part of the food insecurity problem, significant share of global population, relatively small share in production, and basically a non-existing share in domestic support. Next slide, please. And that's the previous picture already tell you about the unfairness of where we are and the problem of unbalancing. But now I think we also need to know that we know not so much about what LDCs are doing. And even LDCs sometimes doesn't. That's also a reality. So if we think just about notification at the WTO, over the 35 currently LDCs that are members of WTO, you have nearly half that have never notified. And if you think about the one that has just notified around or just after the regular round, you basically have half of these countries. The 6 countries have notified things in the last 6 years, or at least having notification that cover the last 6 years in terms of production year. And some of the notifications are actually empty. So if you look for 1/3 of the country, you open the notification and you see, we didn't do anything on agriculture. That's not true, first. But also it means that there is this disconnection between how we use this process in terms of transparency. And for me, it's not about disciplines. It's something that we see at FAO and we have program on that. Many LDCs doesn't have the capacity to properly know what is done within their borders, how the money has been used, especially between what has been budgeted and what has been actually delivered. And that's a key issue in terms of development strategy. And I also think that that's where the WTO should help. You know, it's not because you have some country that doesn't have the capacity to do it that we should let them down. No, we have to double down and to say, let's use this to help, you know, knowing better what the policy you are designing in order to make sure we have the right rules to the policy you are implementing and not just the top of the iceberg. So that's for me something we should not neglect. When then you look at the actual notification, you will see that many LDCs that notify use green box payments. So here we just have to keep in mind that some of the change in the green box may also impact them. Then they use 6.2 for a lot of subsidies in terms of irrigation, seeds, and fertilizer mainly. And then they have a bit of product-specific support. But even if you look at the ones that are using and potentially using them a lot, like Bangladesh, they will not even reach 5% of their de minimis. So the policy space they have through specific and non-specific de minimis, sometimes you don't even need to use Article 6.2. But it's good to have Article 6.2. And I think it's important to use Article 6.2 for them. But currently, they are not the main user of it. That's just, I think also, there is a lack of fiscal capacity to use the policy space. And that we should not forget when we design the rules, because more flexibility in general is not something that will benefit them in particular. And we still have, as I've said, when you look at this, you still have some inefficient policies. So you have some LDC that are going to subsidize crops that are exported. And you can say, it's good because it brings revenue. But actually, when you do the economics of it, you basically subsidize the consumption of other people outside. So sometimes you even subsidize the consumption of rich people. But also, because the subsidies are used to pay, for example, fertilizer that are imported from an external current account, or just in terms, does it bring dollars or not? The net effect is no. So really, you know, having this clarity of policies and policy objectives will also, I think, help LDCs to better use the limited resources they have. And in some cases, because LDCs are like any country in the world, some of the subsidies are driven by political economy. It can be good to use external discipline to try to deal with your domestic problems. Many high-income countries have done it. Some middle-income countries have even done it. So I think, you know, how you use external disciplines to deal with your local problems can be a way. But then I think also we have this issue of countries, LDC, that are graduating, especially when they start to have the means of using this policy space, there is a risk to take it out. And really, if we want to do development, we need also stability in policies. So I will say, you know, how we deal with the graduation period. And this question about vulnerability or vulnerable countries will be important. So I would say policy space in general is not a problem for LDCs. We just want to make sure that future changing rules, especially for them, protect 6.2. But also, and going through the different LDC notification, you see that how people are balancing things between Green Box 6.2 and product-specific support. Different LDCs use different ways to notify. So I think for the LDC group working together to say, how we notify these policies in order to make sure that if tomorrow we have new guidelines for green box, or if we have new guidelines for 6.2 to avoid, abuse by some player, that this level of details and discussion will be important. Next slide, please. Now, just to say, we have clearly in a world that have changed, but something that have not changed is the fact that LDCs are still net food and agricultural importer, and not by a small amount. So they basically import $68 billion of agricultural and food products. They export 35. So it means that every time food prices go up, that's for them a current account problem. And that's going to be important in all the discussion we want to have on global subsidies. Less subsidies mean higher food prices on global markets. And this will have to be managed. And the short-term effect will be more pressure on the current account of LDCs. Now, over the last 18 years, actually 17 years, because it's between 2005 and 2022, the export of LDCs in constant dollars have been multiplied by 2.7, then import by 2.8. So this trade deficit has not exploded per se, but we still see a bit of deepening. Intra-LDC trade has grown, but not as much as their trade with the global level. Also because the size of these economies have not grown as fast as other economies. But their traditional markets, so here I take the example of the EU, have seen some moderate increase. So they're basically double their import from the EU. They have increased by 45% the export to the EU, but actually the export to China has been multiplied by 5. And now the export of LDCs of food and agricultural products to China are bigger than their export to the EU. So when we think about which markets are important, not only in terms of market access, but where distortion or not can occur, it's no more high-income countries versus developing countries. These different dynamics have to be taken into account to understand which really distortion at the end matter. In terms of product, we still a number of concentrated imports: wheat, rice, vegetable oil, sugar, and cotton. And it's important to understand that some LDCs are importing cotton, some LDCs are exporting cotton. So here also, when we think about diversification and value chain, that's important. But also what is occurring now is processed food is more imported by LDCs. And unfortunately, cigarettes, but that's another issue. But on the export side, we still see these traditional key commodities: coffee, cotton, groundnut. We see a growth of cashew, sesame, also maize, including within Africa. I think that's a pretty interesting change in pattern. Vegetables, and also tobacco. And here my point is, yes, we will need to be careful about too much concentration of subsidies in cotton, but cotton is not the only commodity that matters for LDCs. So when we think about concentration, in some case, we have to go beyond cotton. They are not all distorted in the same way, but just to say that LDCs have started to diversify, and so which market are distorted start to change. And also, I want to point that on some specific markets, we have seen LDCs taking advantage of their size and some of the specific scheme they benefit from, like organic food. If you see on the EU market, now 10% of imported organic products come from LDCs. So much more than any, I would say, global share of LDC trade on global markets. But it also means that if we start to see more subsidies to organic food, for instance, from the producer point of view, that can also mean more competition for the type of product they want to specialize in. Put it differently, LDCs, a lot of producers in LDCs are doing very low input agriculture today. They are naturally doing kind of organic production. As soon as they certify, they can jump in this market. But if tomorrow you see more and more countries subsidizing their own organic production, actually you can start to create this competition at the niche level. So that's, what do we call a product which matters? Next slide, please, and that will be the last one. So I think here even if the goal is not to make the political economy more complicated, but we need stricter discipline on a number of countries that does not the high-income country. Of course, we want to get rid of the AMS and some of the unfairness of the Euro-round between high-income countries and the developing world. But because LDCs are now competing both on the export side and the import side with other developing countries, the type of disciplines we put for developing countries in general and LDCs are really to be treated very differently, because a number of middle-income countries have the fiscal means to use some of the policy space when the LDCs do not have it. Then, as I've said, we want to avoid the concentration on subsidies on key product, but it should not just be cotton. I mean, cotton is important to deliver on the promises of the past, but some LDCs are also specialized in other products on which we see some concentration of support, in some cases also by other middle-income countries. So we want to be clear that for the main product of interest for LDCs, we may want stricter discipline. And finally, that the whole story about on the short term, the more restriction we put on subsidies, including on some production on soybean, wheat, maize by high income or upper middle income countries, if you start to limit them, food prices will go up. And the first effect will be problems for LDCs. The only way to not make it a problem is to help the LDCs to grow their domestic supply in a sustainable manner in order to move from their major net import situation to a smaller imbalance or even to be export. And that's not going to happen by magic. That's not going to happen just because subsidies in the north are removed. So how we channel ODA and other way to invest in the LDCs, to grow the supply side, to be able to benefit from a reduction of global subsidies is a necessary condition. The reduction of the global subsidies are not going to trigger the supply response we want in LDCs due to a number of other constraints. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating, David, and thank you for bringing the reality of this into the discussion, right? Thank you for helping me see that the concentration is not as concentrated as we thought in the sense of LDC exports. It's a piece of good news, but it also makes for a more complicated, but actually a more interesting picture, right? When we're looking at which forms of domestic support and which products make sense. And thank you for tying all of this back essentially to the point you made at the beginning, right? That even if in the rules LDCs have enough legal policy space, what they lack is the ability to spend well within that policy space. And the question is, even if we manage to remove the AMS completely, what do we do? What do we need to do to trigger the supply side response and to make sure that we're dealing with both sides of the equation, because both matter. Really interesting. Joe, perhaps I'll turn to you next to talk a little bit about public stock holding, because it's a topic that comes up inevitably in every domestic support conversation. And we'll leave aside perhaps sort of the politics of it, but looking at it specifically from an LDC and a vulnerable economy perspective, what does it look like? Go ahead, please.
Great, no, thanks, Alice, and thanks so much for helping to organize this. IFPRI is very happy to co-sponsor this event. I think it's just excellent. The speakers you've been able to put together. My colleague and I, Valeria Pinheiro, have been working in this. We have a book coming out soon on some of these issues, including a chapter on public stockholding, which I'm going to go into briefly here. Next slide, please. You're right, Alice. This topic has been with us for a number of years now. It's been highly contentious. It's often blamed for the problems of the last few ministerials getting any sort of agreement. But I think it's important first to just consider around the world who holds public stocks. I mean, we have a lot of these are just stock levels taking, and you can see that mostly, this isn't a question of the net food importing countries or developing countries or LDCs. they aren't the ones really holding the bulk of the stocks. Some of the larger developing countries like India and China hold vast quantities of corn, wheat, and rice. We saw this. If I had shown this picture from 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you would have seen much more with the developed countries. So you had the US and the EU both having very large public stockholding programs. They sort of diminished considerably in the 90s, but we have seen this increase, particularly since the price spikes back in 2007-8, and again, more recently, because of COVID and because of the war in Ukraine, countries have talked about holding stocks as being some sort of buffer in the event of price spikes. Next slide, please. Again, as a trade issue, as many of you know, I was a negotiator during the Doha talks in the mid-2000s, and it's interesting to me from that point of view is that while we talked about Annex 2, we had debates over that paragraph, it wasn't nearly as controversial as some of the other issues. It did rise with rising prices, however, in the late 2000s, and you can see that gray bar area from about 2005 to 2012, where we saw this enormous increase in market prices, that all of a sudden countries started trying to keep up with those prices and raising administered prices, which pushed many countries towards de minimis limits. This resulted obviously in the ministerial decision, the so-called Bali decision in 2013, to reach an interim solution for public stockholding, which was then in the 2014 General Council meeting said that would remain in effect until a more permanent solution could be found. Unfortunately, that has eluded us to this point. Next slide, please. At root is really this price support component of public stockholding, I think. I think if you look back at the negotiating history, members agreed that public stockholding programs could be considered as non-trade distorting. Again, the focus was largely on if those stock purchases were made at current market prices, as opposed to, say, administered prices. However, as soon as the administered prices were used in public stockholding program, members said, okay, well, then you really do need to at least calculate that the price support component of the PSH and notify that as part of your domestic support commitments. I think we've all seen this formula. We know the calculations from Annex 3 of the Agreement on Agriculture on calculating market price support as being the difference between the administered price and some fixed external price. As was pointed out by Ambassador Cisse, I believe for most countries, that fixed external price has been based on a 3-year average price between the years 1986-88. Next slide, please. Of course, what happened, that period, the 86-88 period, worked very well for about 15 years. If you look at the period, shown up until about 2005, yes, we had some period like the mid-90s when we saw prices rise for a bit, but they typically would fall back down to the 86-88 average or so. So it wasn't a bad proxy for price support. That all changed in the mid-2000s. We had, a biofuel boom. We had a huge increase in consumption of things like soybeans and others in the world. We saw this big increase in prices where we're really, compared to the 86-88 average, you saw prices now, and certainly in recent times have been as high as 4 times that amount. The problem then becomes, as countries increase administered prices to keep up with those rising cash prices, they grew further and further away from the 86-88 base period. Next slide. This is just one case in point. This is from India's notifications. it just shows this point that as these prices began to rise, that dotted line there is essentially the fixed 1986 to 88 average for India. The red line is the administered price that's been notified. And then I put in some average cash prices for India taken from the FAOStat database. And you can see that as that administered price grew further and further from the fixed external reference price, that means the commodity total AMS for rice began to increase substantially. And again, it poses a problem, one, in the sense that very few countries, has been pointed out, actually have bound AMS. You have a few of the net food importing countries that have a bound AMS, no LDCs, for example. Everyone else, then you have to keep those commodity-specific support below de minimis levels. Next slide. Which for most countries, at least developing countries, is 10% of the value of production. I think, largely this, one thing that I would say is there is a clear technical fix here. I don't think there's anything in the negotiating history that suggests that the base period cannot be changed. In fact, there were debates over that. There were proposals put forward. The language of the agreement itself alludes to inflationary impacts that could be taken into account. I think obviously there's been proposals put forward to update to a more recent period or basing the fixed external price on a moving average of prices. I show just the case here of wheat, showing it relative to the 86-88 period, just showing what a 5-year moving average of Olympic average would mean, and that 5-year average throwing out the high and low years. And you see that does a reasonable job of trailing the market price. At times, however, higher than the market price, at times below the market price, like we've seen in recent years. I think a very important issue here is if you're going to update the way the price support is measured for public stockholding programs, shouldn't that be consistent with how price support is measured for all price support? And I would argue that actually they should be the same, but that is far more contentious. Next slide. I think the bigger issue, however, is should the public stockholding program, should that support be exempt from, sorry for the double here, exempt from AMS disciplines or shielded from dispute settlement challenges? Certainly, the concerns of members have been for if price support distorts production and trade, that can lead to price suppression in world markets, that can penalize other exporters, can penalize other producers, and so that there needs to be some recourse for potential adverse trade effects of public stockholding programs. We have had proposals. Brazil put forward a proposal last year that would say, okay, well, perhaps we can consider exemption of PSH support for perhaps LDCs and net food importing countries, but only if the price support program is relatively small. And what do I mean by that? That the stocks are low relative to world stocks, are low relative to production, or in the case where they aren't very large exporters. This chart shows a few of the support programs that have been notified to the WTO under the PSH provisions. And you see that there are countries that have, again, as you saw in the earlier chart, China and India have some of the largest programs, public stockholding programs. But again, as exporters, only India has a program, the rice program in particular, where we have very large global exports. Next slide. So I think my conclusions from this are that unfortunately these provisions have been very contentious, and I think that the politics of it, which I'm not going to get into, I think really kind of in many respects, in my view, really override a lot of the actual issues themselves, because I think the actual issues are pretty technical and can be easily fixed in that sense, in the sense that I believe that it makes sense to update the fixed external reference price. I think tying it to a moving average of past prices, for example, would be perfectly acceptable in my view. And you can debate the formula or how that would be done, but I don't think there's anything in the agreement on agriculture that suggests that that 86-88 period is inviolate, that it should never be changed. I do think that the update should be applied more broadly. I think that Lars may get into this a bit, and certainly in the excellent book that he and David Orden just published, they talk a lot about price support more generally and this problem of the 86-88 base period. But then I think the more critical issue is whether or not that support should remain subject to discipline. And I do believe that that is very, very important. That is, we can't let this program, PSH, be a loophole where we do have explosion of a program where we could see price suppression or other sorts of things. Members have to have some recourse to take a case in those few cases, and I think they would be few cases where we would see large exports or such. And that briefly is where I think this issue comes down. I look forward to the comments, and thanks so much again, Alice, for the putting this program together.
No, not at all, Joe. Well, and thank you very much for some very thoughtful insights right into this. You know, usually at IISD we're very conscious of the politics, but what we do try and encourage everyone, including negotiators, to do is to try and see through the politics where you can to the underlying policy issue and to focus the discussion there to the extent we can. And now, Lars, there's been a lot on the table. We do have a solid 20 minutes ahead of us. I'll only ask for 60 seconds at the end for my concluding comments. I do want to make sure we have enough time for you to walk through how this all starts to come together and how this compares to what's actually on the table at the WTO. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Alice, for that introduction. And I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to participate in this webinar organized by the IISD and IFPRI on domestic support in agriculture. Next slide, please. And we can actually skip this outline slide. So we'll go to the next slide. Yes. So when I think of the concerns about domestic support in agriculture, I think about the entitlement to a final bound total AMS that is larger than nil, and only 33 members have that entitlement, which is a concern to many other members. And the size of the final bound total AMS can be a concern because a few members have a very large final bound total AMS, and just having a final bound total AMS allows you to have product-specific AMSs that exceed their de minimis levels, and that allows for concentration on individual products. And there's also a concern about the large room for AMS support within the de minimis allowances, and some may even wish for more room within the allowances. There is a concern about the absence of an effective limit on several categories of distorting support, and that would include distorting input subsidies under Article 6.2, distorting blue box payments, and distorting price support with the help of producer prices set by the government. And there is a concern about insufficient transparency. And of course, many members think there is a need to ensure that green box rules are fit for purpose in a changing world. Next slide, please. This table lists the 5 members with the largest amounts of domestic support that they have notified in their last notification. And on the top row, in the row called sum of all domestic support, we see two members, China and the United States, each one with domestic support notified at more than $200 billion. And in both cases, most of that notified support consists of green box support. But in China, most of that green box support consists of expenditures on general services. And in the United States, most of the green box support consists of domestic food aid or nutrition assistance. We can move down a few lines to the row called sum of Article 6 support, and we see one large amount there of $60 billion in the column for India, and most of that is the amount of input subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, electricity and irrigation, for example, that India exempts under Article 6.2. And we will move down two rows to the sum of all AMSs, and I will add up a few numbers there. I will add the $9 billion for China, the 9 for the European Union, the 5 for Japan, the 21 for the United States, and the sum of those four amounts is $44 billion. And that tells us that the amount of distorting input subsidies that India exempts under Article 6.2 is of the same order of magnitude as the sum of all distorting AMS support that the other four large support members have notified. And we can move down to the row called current total AMS, and the significance of it is that, of course, it is much smaller for some of these members, but not for all, much smaller than the sum of all AMSs, because the current total AMS does not include the de minimis AMSs. We'll move to the next slide, please. This table shows the three proposals in the columns, and we will start with the top row about least developed countries, and if there's any mention in any of the proposals. And the only proposal that mentions LDCs is the Cairns Group and Ukraine proposal. And I don't think we should assume that India and the African group ignore the fact that the Agreement on Agriculture and the special and differential treatment actually does exempt LDCs from any reduction commitments. So the absence may not be, or mention may not be all that significant in those two proposals. The next three rows are about AMS support, and the row called total AMS commitment is of some interest. It tells us that the African group and India propose to use the total AMS commitment or the final bound total AMS as if it were equal to nil. That means that no AMS would be allowed to exceed its de minimis level. And that's in contrast to the Cairns Group proposal, which would use the total AMS commitment as the final cap on the sum of AMSs and input subsidies in under 6.2 and blue box payments under 6.5. And then each one of these three proposals has a lot of rules for what kind or what amounts of support you could exempt from the various caps, and the rules for establishing or revising the caps that we see in the Agreement on Agriculture. So I will not get into the details of that here. We move down to the next two rows about Article 6.2 and Article 6.5. And again, we see the Cairns Group is a bit more specific about some new rules, and we see some rules for what kind of support or what amounts of support would be exempt from the final cap that the Cairns Group proposal would put in place. The blue box payments are of some interest because the African group would put a limit on the blue box payments. And the Cairns Group is also concerned about blue box payments and would include them under the limit or the final cap. And moving down to the green box payments, there is a similar concern about green box payments on the part of the African group. They would put a limit or a cap on the sum of green box payments. And the Cairns Group would review and update, which could lead to other changes for the green box payments under paragraphs 5 to 13. The bottom row, very bottom row, is a place where we see that all three proposals actually mention notification requirements as something that would lead to better transparency. Next slide, please. So there is perhaps a bit of a shared ground in these three selected proposals. I mentioned the special and differential treatment being an integral part of the agreement on agriculture and of the negotiations, and that LDCs would be exempt from the reduction commitments. The large final bound total AMS is an important parameter here, and it would affect the timing of the capping of de minimis AMSs or the size of the final cap. And these proposals go about these caps in different ways. I won't get into the details there. You can read it later on. The trade-based indicators is a bit of a new idea. You would use trade-based indicators to govern the size of the product-specific caps on AMSs at 10% or even up to larger percentages, such as 100% of value production. And the trade-based indicators is that's the word I use here for the share of imports in consumption, or the share of the product of a member in the global exports of the product. That's what I mean by trade-based indicators. The blue box payments under Article 6.5 would be subject to a cap of some sort, whether it's its own cap or the final cap. And Annex 2 green box payments would have their own cap, or at least they would be reviewed and updated. And as I mentioned, transparency would in all cases be improved through enhanced notification requirements. And next slide, please. The vulnerable economies that we are talking about today are, of course, they face, of course, very many particular circumstances, but no proposal, not one of the three proposals actually mentions the NFIDCs or small island developing states. But there seems to be some attention to the issues that these vulnerable economies face. For example, one proposal introduces the idea of a severe food crisis, and you would think that a severe food crisis would be of particular relevance to be looked after if you are an LDC or an NFIDC or a small island development state. And in a severe food crisis, you would be able to raise your AMSs beyond the established de minimis percentages for some period of time. And by my count, there are about 20 developing countries that are small island developing states, but they are not least developed countries. And if you are a small island developing country, you have low value production. And that means that under one of the proposals, you would get a very low new cap on certain support. And the proposal says, well, let's just raise the final cap up to some larger amount, such as $250 million or $750 million, which would be much larger than the value production-based cap would give you. The vulnerable economies are dependent on imports, but import dependency varies by product. And what we see here in one of the proposals is that if you have a greater import dependency, you would have a larger cap on that product-specific support, or that product support would not be capped at all. And the developing countries would have a particular exemption for input subsidies and that are targeted to the low-income or resource-poor producers, and if they are less than $5 billion, they would not be subject to the final cap. So that's a fairly significant amount that that would be exempt from the final cap. Next slide, please. So when I look at these proposals, one thing that I find remarkable is that not one of the proposals mentions the calculation of market price support. And we know, as we have heard, that the calculation of market price support is such an important issue for the issue called public stock holding for food security purposes. And it has to do with, as Joe explained, the fact that the reference prices are out of date, and for many products, they are in recent years much larger than they were in the 1986 to 88 period. So what we do under the current rules is to measure something we call market price support, but it doesn't measure actual support at all. It measures some meaningless variable that is of no relevance to any government's policy making. So if market price support amounts were measured soundly, we would in many cases have market price support for a product that would be nil, or at least for many products it would be much smaller than under current rules. And we would have the advantage that the caps on product-specific EMS support would actually apply to actual support, not to this imaginary meaningless variable that is now what is being limited by the Agreement on Agriculture. And all three proposals say they are targeting what they call trade distorting domestic support, but their ambitions differ very much. And to just give the three examples here, that one of the proposals would eliminate the room for above de minimis AMSs for 11 members. And we don't know how much AMS room there would be for the other 22 members where we would use special and differential treatment to come up with new rules. And another proposal would eliminate the above de minimis AMSs for all the 33 members with a positive final bound total AMS, with developing country flexibility and with limits on blue box and green box payments. And the third proposal would cap and reduce the global room for non-green box support, Article 6 support, with LDCs being exempt, and there would be new caps on product-specific AMSs. So what I see here is the need to define what we mean by trade distorting domestic support. And perhaps the fundamental requirement in what is called the Green Box, Annex 2, could be of some help here. The fundamental requirement talks about policy measures that have no or at most minimal trade distorting effects or effects on production. So if you submit a policy measure to a test to see, does it have more than minimal effects? Does it fail to meet the criterion of having at most minimal effects? Well, then let's call it trade distorting. And then trade distorting domestic support is support under all trade distorting measures. And that's what we would discipline if we want to discipline trade distorting domestic support, with some tolerances for small acceptable deviations from the established norm in engineering sense, is the way I use the word tolerance there. And that would put us on the way to actually delivering on what Article 20 of the agreement tells us to do, which is to run a process of policy reform that will result in a reduction in support and protection. And next slide, please, is my final slide. And I will mention, as Joe did, that we talk about these issues at some depth in the book that David Orden and I published last year on domestic support. And with that, I would thank you for your attention.
Lars, thank you very much indeed. And I'm an inveterate promoter of all IISD products, so fair enough, feel free to promote your book at the end as well. Listen, we've covered a huge amount of ground as I look back at my notes here, right? We've talked about, from Monsieur Cissé's very clear presentation of the LDC's top priorities, the preservation of flexibilities, looking at cotton, clarifying the green box, picking up an SSM. We've walked through Taisha's, again, very clear explanation of the needs for food security, preserving existing flexibilities for current and potentially future subsidies, leveling the playing field and what we do about the aggregate measures of support. And then David and Joe, I think, really helped to bring home sort of the outside economic realities of some of these concepts, right? So David was talking about the very practical need to help LDCs graduate and think about the rules that apply to them when they graduate, looking at what LDCs actually export and what they import. So if we're thinking about focusing on products of export interest to LDCs, that list is actually changing, which is a good thing. The exports are diversifying, and it makes it a different sort of picture. And then in the end, we came back to Lars's point, or Lars's several points, I think, about what's on the table and how far these proposals actually respond to some of these interests that we've heard, right? So all three proposals, if I read your slides correctly, Lars, I mean, all three of these main proposals target trade distorting domestic support, even if the ambitions differ, fine. And in a sense, they all respond in some measure to what Monsieur Cissé and Taisha were calling for, right? Addressing the real trade distorting effects of domestic support, particularly on products of export interest from an LDC and an Africa Group perspective. And I think, again, sort of David's really interesting presentation gave us a sense of what those products could be. What is it that LDCs are exporting and what matters to them? But I was struck, Lars, by your numbers slide, and I suspect all of your slides are going to be printed out and pasted at the front of several negotiators' notebooks. Because what was interesting about your calculations slide is that trade distorting domestic support, if I read it correctly, is actually found throughout, right? It's in the AMS. It's potentially in import subsidies under 6.2, in as far as those subsidies are potentially trade distorting import subsidies. They may even be found within the green box, right? In paragraphs 5 to 13, which the Africa Group proposals could use some additional clarification, you know, if those subsidies turn out to be trade distorting as well. So I think the point that I take in particular from that slide is that if we want to really address trade distorting domestic support, there might be a contribution to be made from a range of players across a range of different boxes. And I come back here to your very important point about fixing the underlying problem of how we define and how we measure what is trade distorting domestic support, which I think underlies whichever box you're thinking about. And then to come back, perhaps, or to pull in a point you made, David, along the way, even if we do manage to reduce, as we must, the levels of trade distorting domestic support, leveling the playing field, as Taisha was saying, reducing the subsidies from those who provide them when they distort trade, we face a risk that this will eventually raise food prices, which from an NFIDC's perspective could be a real problem. So as we manage this reduction of trade distorting domestic support, as we level the playing field, we have to simultaneously make sure that LDCs and those that depend on food can increase their own production, right? Otherwise, we risk a food security problem, at least in the short term. And there's probably some really interesting discussions to be had about more broadly how that can happen. So yes, rules important, some really interesting insights there. But that's only part of the equation. We have very clearly the need to keep the flexibilities that are there, both in 6.2 and other places. And the issue, it seems to be partly retaining that policy space, but as David was saying, making sure that countries with policy space are able to use it wisely, right? To understand what they're spending, to understand where they're spending it, and how to do that to ensure they're producing sustainably. And again, the challenge usually is not so much LDC's use of 6.2 in the development box, but its use by much larger developing countries. And as David was saying, there's now quite a wide range of countries who are using different kinds of domestic support. And again, there's no easy solution to this. This has been just a first pass over these important issues. But I think at the end of the day, we want a development exceptions where they exist to enable members to support the low income and their resource poor farmers as envisaged, but without impeding the ability of other developing members to do the same. So there's a political and I think a technical and economic balance to be struck there. I won't close the webinar without coming back to the question of severe food crises, particularly because for those most dependent on international trade for food security, in particular the NFIDCs, LDCs for some important, in particular processed food, David, and for SIDS, a severe food crisis is an existential threat. It's something we can tend to forget, sitting in Switzerland as I do, but it is an existential threat. And ensuring that the rules help countries to manage that threat and to respond to it when it comes, I think is crucial. Listen, we're 4 minutes over time, which given the amount of content, I think is not bad. Thank you very, very much, Omar, Taisha, for giving us your perspectives, and to Joe and to David and to Lars for putting some really interesting and really insightful thinking on the table for us. This is not the end of this discussion. There will be plenty more. And my colleague Facundo Calvo, who's put this together, who's the real agriculture expert, is of course standing by if any delegates on the line would like to talk about this in a bit more depth. Thank you again to the speakers. Thank you to IFPRI for co-hosting this with us. And a huge thanks to my colleagues also, Samiksha and Aish, for making sure this ran so smoothly. Thank you very much indeed.